Hello, today I'm going to take you through the basic functionality of the Preference Terms Dictionary, starting with the search. So when you first visit the Preference Terms Dictionary, you see a list of these entries, which we'll get into in a minute. There are 1,000 plus groupings of these entries. To limit the number of results, you just enter something here in the search terms, hit enter. So what are these things that you're looking at? Basically, they are a collection of ways of describing a single setting. So for example, contrast. Contrast is a very clear example because its meaning is very clear and it's used very commonly. So we'll start with this one. Um, this collection consists of a term, which we can see this is a term record, uh, and then a series of aliases. So collectively, these are the ways that we know of describing this setting. So the term, or common term as we've called it, is not a better or worse way to describe this. It's just a reference version that we've identified to make it possible to group all of these things. And why is it important to group these things? Because we want to be able to go from a setting that someone's expressed, for example, in totem, to a setting that they've expressed in to a setting in cheese, or to a setting in Windows, or to a setting in OS X. We want to be able to move from one example of this setting to applying that in many applications. That's the core of what we're trying to do with the Preference Terms Dictionary. So this looks fairly simple because this view interface only shows you what's defined. But I'll go through the fields that are described here. We've talked about the record type, which in this case is a term. The definition should tell us the meaning of this web of related settings, or this web of ways of describing a setting, rather. In many cases, it's not defined currently. That's one of the things we need to fix. Excuse me, but the definition should hold true for every one of the aliases and the term itself. If something doesn't fit the definition, if it's used in different circumstances, if it means something else, not just different wording, but literally means something else, and it wouldn't be appropriate to interchangeably use the settings, then we need another term. So that's the heart of why you have terms, why you have aliases, and why some things are together and why some things are not. It's kind of a not an easy concept, but it's what makes the PTD work. So we'll go through and hopefully it'll be clear as we look through some more examples. I wanted to show you as well the suggested interface label, which is meant to be a human readable version of this. It looks kind of funny because we have the word contrast and it's just uppercase here, but as you can see, we have very many variations that are too long, not very human-centered, and we also would have suggested labels for these. So the final thing is the status. We'll get into that when we're doing a bit of editing. So I'm going to log in. I already have an account. You can create one yourself. Yeah, all right. So sorry for that interruption. So now we're on the editing screen, which gives us the full range of things. You can see that these records allow a lot more information than is actually entered. Even for something as incredibly important as contrast, we lack, for example, a meaningful definition. This needs to be fixed. But obviously, we'll get to it when we get to it. So let me continue down to the other data that we also don't have, but which is also important. We should be saying what the value space is for this, so the range of acceptable values for this setting. And this is, again, core to the way the PTD works. If we know how application A describes contrast, and we know how the reference currency is for this, let's say a scale from 0 to 100, we can say, okay, high, low, and medium in this context mean 0, 50, and 100, and 0 and 50 and 100 mean 0, 5, and 10 in this other application that uses 0 through 10. We can basically go through from one example of what the users told us they want, and we can try to come up with other examples of what the user might want. So we don't have a lot of suggested default value data, but we do have stuff. But what we do have is in an uneven format. What it should be is just a free text description of the allowed values. It could be a range of whole numbers from 0 to 100, for example. It could be one of the following values: high, low, medium, where high represents the highest contrast, right? It should give you an idea as a human of what this means. We'll probably also need to add structured data, but for now, we don't even have a description of the value space. So let's move on to the suggested default value. This is purely informational. It's never going to be used to change anyone's settings. It just gives you an idea of what the most common setting for this tends to be across applications, and common default setting, so that you have an idea of where people might be starting. So this is, again, purely informational, but you might use it, for example, when constructing test scenarios, or just to understand what your users are likely to start with. Anyway, it's not meant to suggest that you should use this value, or that this is what everyone should use by default. So you probably won't end up using it very much, but if you see it, that's what it means. So the notes field is basically Pirate Pad for records. You can keep any working notes about the record. It's only visible to editors, which is everyone. So please do so be civil, but it's a place to keep track of something that we don't have structured data for, any questions you might have, etc. And it is indexed by the search, so once you're logged in, you can find things that you've tagged. It's what we have instead of tagging and other mechanisms to help you make notes about records while you're working. Eventually we will have much finer grained tools, but for now, just enter anything you feel is relevant as you work on it. It's okay. So the last thing to talk about is the status, which is basically our workflow. Each one of these represents a stage in the workflow. Right now you can move from any stage to any others, and everyone can make any change. Eventually there will be rules about who can do what, and there'll be a logical progression from draft to unreviewed to candidate to approved. Deleted, we don't ever delete information. We may periodically call records from this first iteration, these purely garbage values that came from computerized imports, but it's likely we would keep most deleted data just not visible for people. So you can see this is not a real-time inline editing scenario. You have to actually explicitly save your changes. We may have to revisit that, but for now, just know it's not saved until you hit that button, and then you'll see a feedback message once you've done it. So this is the term. It has certain fields. If we drill into an alias, it opened in a new tab, so the other stuff is still there. We're still working on that workflow, but you get the idea. No work is lost. Your work in progress is still available. You can see that the record type is different. We could actually try to create a term instead, but you're going to want to be careful when switching these things. We're still kind of working on that. So you can see here, I have gone through and entered some uses data for this one. This is used obviously by org genome totem. It's a good example of what you would use uses for. We've talked about uses before. What we haven't talked about is the alias of field. An alias only makes sense if it's related to a term. So the term is the spoke that holds all of these aliases together, so that we can go from any the hub that holds all these spokes together. All these aliases are the spokes, and we can go from any point to any other as long as we have reference to this term, as long as we know they're related to this common term. And why not just make them a loosely coupled web related to each other? Because we need a common currency to say each point can be converted to the central value, and we can convert from the central value to each other point. We need to guarantee that we have some way to do the conversion, and this is the system we've come up with to do that. So we've talked about the rest of it. You can see that by default the records are unreviewed. I wanted to show you briefly, if you do find yourself moving records around between different aliases, this is basically a full text search of just terms. So you can only link to a term, only terms are suggested, and their term label is what's suggested, so that you can pretty easily pick this, right? We've had a request for linking to related records. We'll use something similar for that. So that's basically editing both types of record. I'll take you briefly through the create an account process. If you don't already have an account, just enter the username you want, put in an email address, and tell me the password you want twice. You'll get an email that lets you verify your account. Once you've done that, you can log in. So everyone can log in and everyone can make edits at this point, but it is backed up and has a version history within the database. Eventually we'll have pretty fine-grained controls to show you who did what, but don't worry, it's safe to edit, and if you encounter any problems, please get in touch. The best way is to use the feedback button, which points to Jira, and we'll create a ticket there. You can also send me email. You're welcome to. And I hope that that's made things clearer and not raised more questions than it's answered. I'll also provide a transcript, which is similar, but more structured as a document. So thanks for your time.